Okay, we're going to start your notes over causes of the Civil War. This next unit is going to be a very short unit. We're going to be reviewing the information from 8th grade over the Civil War. Hopefully this is all review for you guys and you've already heard a lot of these things. But if not, you can get these things from the video. Okay, in this video we're going to be reviewing the different causes, the things that led to or contributed to the breakout of the American Civil War. And as you guys know, the Civil War was in the United States between the North and the South from 1861 until 1865. The first major cause of the American Civil War was the idea of sectionalism. And from 8th grade, you guys should remember that sectionalism is just when you have more loyalty to a section or a region of a nation than you have for the nation as a whole. And this was really evident in the North and in the South, because in the North, their economy was centered around manufacturing and factories and shipping, small farms. They really focused on industry in the North. And so they really had this sense of community among themselves. In the South, their economy depended on large plantations, cotton plantations, tobacco plantations, indigo plantations, these large-scale farms that really they saw the slaves as a necessity. With the tariff system that was going on in the United States, it caused a rift between the sections because the North thought the South should buy their goods. Therefore, that caused some sectionalism as well. The West, they were pretty much a section to themselves. The main problem in the West is whether or not to allow slaves, but they kind of established their own identity in becoming like a breadbasket, and they were really responsible for shipping a lot of the grain to the North and the South. So you have this idea of sectionalism. You have the idea that the North and the South are two different sections of the United States. They don't have much in common, and they kind of are not so much at odds with each other, but they have their economies are set up completely different, so they really couldn't identify with each other. The second cause, as we well know, is slavery. In 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which was just the machine that you could put the cotton through and the seeds would be taken out. And this really increased the need for slaves. The faster that the cotton could be cleaned, the faster it needed to be harvested. So after the invention of the cotton gin, the need for slaves and slave labor really went through the roof because they needed people to be operating the cotton gin, harvesting the cotton, and getting things out faster. Northern abolitionists were really very passionate about getting rid of slavery. They believed that it was morally wrong. And you should know that the word abolitionist was just a person who wanted to get rid of slavery. They wanted to abolish the idea of slavery. Some examples of the abolitionists in the North: Harriet Beecher Stowe, she wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Tubman, she was responsible for helping slaves get to the northern states and to Canada on the Underground Railroad. And hopefully you've heard of Frederick Douglass, a really influential African-American former slave turned abolitionist. Once he was educated, he was able to get his freedom and become really active in the abolitionist movement. But you have the South, who is starting to need more slaves, and then you have this abolitionist movement going on in the North that really conflicts with that. Another huge issue that was being dealt with during the Civil War was states' rights. We've talked a little bit about states' rights in class in some of our bell ringers, but the main thing that started the states' rights debate was the nullification crisis. And this is during the time of Andrew Jackson in 1832. The nullification crisis was just when the Tariff of Abominations, or the protective tariff, was issued in 1828 on any foreign goods. And we know that a tariff is just a tax on foreign goods. What was happening was the South would always get their goods from overseas. They were always taking advantage of the lower prices of the foreign goods. Well, whenever the Industrial Revolution started and industry started to really grow in the North, the North wanted the South to buy goods from them. So Andrew Jackson issued a tariff on any goods coming in from outside of the United States to really discourage overseas trade. Well, this made people in the South very upset because they could get goods much cheaper overseas before the tariff. So what happened was South Carolina basically tried to declare the tariff null or canceled. That word null just means canceled. And some people felt like the states had really created the federal government so they could override its power. And they felt like that they had the right to nullify a law or secede from the Union if they chose to. If that law was not working for the best interest of that state, then they could rule that law null or canceled. So people that subscribed to this belief, they were states' rights activists, or they believed in states' rights. They felt like the federal government was not the supreme power, that the states had the power to say, no, we don't want to follow that law. The opponents to this believed that the states did not have the right to leave the Union, or they did not have the right to override or nullify a law, and these were mostly northern people. So you have that kind of issue there. Another thing that really got in the way, as you guys know, before the Civil War, Henry Clay, the great compromiser, came up with the Compromise of 1850 and the Missouri Compromise. And those two compromises just made sure that the amount of slave states and the amount of free states were equal, so that there was no one in Congress that had more power than the other. Well, in 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that pretty much just allowed the settlers in those two territories to decide for themselves whether or not they wanted slavery or not. So they got to hold a vote to determine, does our state want slavery, or does our state want to be free once we become a state? Well, this led to some problems. It led to what is known as Bleeding Kansas. And pretty much what happened is a lot of people from Missouri, a lot of slavery supporters snuck into Kansas and voted illegally in favor of slavery, causing what is known as Bleeding Kansas. And it was just a lot of bloodshed, a lot of fighting, a lot of battles going on between the people, a lot of riots and different kinds of revolts going on in Kansas that was causing problems, and Kansas became known as Bleeding Kansas because of this incident. Another thing that led to some increased tensions between the North and the South was the Dred Scott v. Stanford decision. Dred Scott was a slave, and he went with his owner, he traveled with his owner into many free territories, while his owner was over him. Well, when his owner dies, Scott decides that he's going to sue for his freedom, since while he was under his owner's possession, he had traveled to free territories and he had lived in free territories. So he decided to sue for his freedom. Well, the ruling was that slaves are property and that Congress didn't have the right to take away a slaveholder's property. So it kind of it said basically that he was property, he had no right to bring a case to court, and he also had no right, Congress didn't have the right to take over that slave owner's property. So this was a win for the South. Dred Scott did not win this case, but it also put many of the compromises into question, whether or not Congress could say that a state would be free or slave owning, because they just had ruled that they couldn't take away a slaveholder's property. So it kind of was interesting, kind of discredited a lot of their compromises. It also upset a lot of the abolitionists in the North because of this ruling, but the slave owners in the South claimed it as a victory for them. Another thing that really contributed to the Civil War's beginning was John Brown's raid. You guys have probably heard of this before, but John Brown, he was a radical abolitionist. He broke into an arsenal, which is just kind of like a gun storage facility in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, and he was going to go in there and he was going to steal a bunch of guns, and he was going to gather a group of slaves to lead a slave revolt across the South. What ends up happening is once John Brown gets into the arsenal, his plan is quickly crushed, authorities come in, and Brown was executed in that raid. But the result of his raid was it raised a lot of fear among these Southern slave owners. It raises lots of concern. They start to worry that their slaves are going to want to revolt. So they get a kind of a closer handle on their slaves, and they start to really not want to let go of that institution of slavery. It did win the sympathy of many Northern abolitionists and kind of really John Brown was able to gain a lot of admirers from them and kind of gave them the charge that they needed to continue with abolition and continue to want to get rid of slavery. The final straw that kind of broke the camel's back with the whole Civil War causes was the election of 1860. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected as president. He ran in the Republican Party. The Republican Party was a party that was created to stop the spread of slavery in the territories. And so Lincoln wins. In the southern states, once he is elected, they were very fearful that his first move will be to abolish slavery across the South. So what he does, or what the South does, starting with South Carolina, they individually start to secede or break away. Y'all know what that word secede means. It just means to break away from the Union. And South Carolina is the first one to break away. And the other southern states, one by one, start to join, and they form the Confederate States of America. And there, South Carolina seceding encouraged the other southern states to do that, and it starts the Civil War. These are just some of the causes, some of the conflicts that were going on between the North and the South that really led to the Civil War. Next time we're going to talk about the events of the Civil War. I hope you knew most of this from review. And if you have any questions, write them down and I will talk to you about them when you come to class. I will see you guys next time.